Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am glad to have an opportunity to speak to Bill C45, which will bring in a wide-ranging set of changes to our lives. First, let me say that the NDP has a proud 45-year history of championing marijuana decriminalization. We have been asking the Liberals to immediately decriminalize simple possession of marijuana as an interim measure, as many young and racialized Canadians continue to receive charges and criminal records that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Not to mention the thousands of Canadians who have criminal records for simple possession of a substance that will soon cease to be illegal. Mr. Speaker, the changes to the law that Bill C45 will bring are long overdue. But while we wait for the bill to become law, why won't the government bring in interim measure of decriminalization? Or at the very least, why won't they invoke prosecutorial and police discretion to cease enforcing an unjust law? In their election platforms, the Liberals claim that arresting and prosecuting these offences is expensive for our criminal justice system. It traps too many Canadians in the criminal justice system for minor, non-violent offences. Given the current situation of an overloaded justice system where cases are being thrown out and charges stayed because of long delays in courts, it just doesn't make any sense to keep charging Canadians for simple possession of marijuana. I'm particularly concerned about the continued criminalization of cannabis because Saskatchewan is the place you're most likely to get busted for simple possession of marijuana, and Saskatoon tops the list of major Canadian cities. According to the 2014 data from Statistics Canada, 77% of the time Saskatoon police stop someone suspected of having pot, they lay a charge. That compares with 48% in Regina, and the Canadian average is 39%. Meanwhile, if you look at the per capita rates of pot charges, Saskatoon ranks 4th behind Kelowna, Gatineau, and Sherbrooke. Overall, in 2014, police reported more than 104,000 drug offences, of which two-thirds, 66%, were related to cannabis, and mainly possession of cannabis. The government has yet to explain their reasoning for refusing to decriminalize marijuana, and their intransigence is adding to the confusion. Indeed, even law enforcement agencies and experts agree that inconsistencies abound. Neil Boyd, the director of the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, has concerns about who is facing criminal consequences for pot possession. And I quote, "I don't think we can really be confident that the law is being applied equally," Boyd said. "We know that young people with fewer resources and less access to private space are going to be much more likely to be processed for this offence than people who are older and have access to private space." Boyd said some people may see outdoor use of marijuana as a nuisance. It could be a civil fine for public use of cannabis. That would be entirely legitimate. But to treat a person who's using cannabis as a criminal, it's like using a sledgehammer for a flea. 2 years ago, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police called for the option to write a ticket for simple possession, noting that right now their only choice is to lay charges or turn a blind eye. In fact, even the Prime Minister himself has admitted that the rich and well-connected have an easier time avoiding a criminal record, while citing the example of his late brother Michael. Their father, Pierre Trudeau, reached out to his friends in the legal community and got the best possible lawyer and was very confident that he was going to be able to make those charges go away. People from minority communities, marginalized communities without economic resources are not going to have that kind of option to go through and clear their name in the justice system, end quote. Not all of us have the connections, of course, that the Trudeaus have, and tens of thousands of Canadians will end up having criminal records for life. Why? Because despite the Prime Minister's remarks to the contrary during the election campaign, the Minister for Public Safety has stated that the government has no interest in granting a blanket pardon for people with criminal records for possessing small amounts of cannabis. There is also no indication that the Liberals are interested in making pardons easier to obtain, or if they will address the high $631 fee for an application. Not being able to access a pardon remains a serious obstacle for people trying to escape their criminal past and move on with their lives. Why won't the Liberals commit to pardoning those who have previous convictions for simple possession of marijuana?
Good question.
Mr. Speaker, aside from the confusion surrounding the pardons and the continued criminalization of simple possession, there are many questions that remain unanswered. There are questions regarding the proposed cannabis tracking system. What does it mean for the privacy of Canadians? How will the data be managed? How much will it cost to implement? For the moment, Health Canada cannot say anything other than it intends to offset such costs through licensing and other fees. Clearly, we need more details and a fulsome discussion around these important questions. We also need answers on crossing the border for those who admit to smoking marijuana. For instance, the Prime Minister himself could be sanctioned at the border and banned for life if he did not have a diplomatic passport. We already have a host of problems at the border, with Canadians being stopped, interrogated, and turned away without good cause. How is the government proposing to deal with any or all of these irritants for Canadians at the border? One of the negative health consequences of criminalization of cannabis has been a widely acknowledged lack of scientific research into the health impacts of cannabis use, especially chronic, long-term use, particularly among young people. One especially grave concern is the fact that there is at present very little research available on the impact of cannabis on the development of the young brain. We in the NDP will continue to press the government to begin establishing research plans and funding into these important areas. I have also heard from many seniors in my constituency who would like to be better informed and supported as they try to navigate the confusing medical marijuana maze. In fact, an estimated 90% of prescription holders are accessing cannabis illegally rather than through licensed producers. Many Canadians with ailments and chronic pain issues may prefer medical marijuana over opiates as a treatment option. However, the task force highlighted the need for access to accurate information on the risks and negative effects of cannabis. With the lack of enough peer-reviewed, credible research on the impact of cannabis use, there is a tendency of cannabis activists to overstate the capacity of cannabis to heal or cure certain chronic conditions. I think all Canadians will benefit from a robust, well-researched and prominent public information and education programs. But the government has not been clear about how they'll be funding public education and research and how that will be rolled out. Will the Liberals commit to using revenues from the cannabis legalization for public awareness, prevention and treatment? Bill C45 also leaves many key issues to the provinces, who will need time to set up their own regulatory systems. Yet another reason that this process should have started earlier, indeed. The task force report calls upon all levels of government to quickly build capacities to create, compliable cannabis policies and regulations. It will be a complicated policy task. Western Canadian economic opportunities to seize the economic potential of new thriving cannabis sector are unprecedented. The determining factor between profit and loss, both for businesses and governments, is how effectively the regulatory framework is created, implemented, and monitored. But what remains unclear is what the tax structure and revenue structure will look like for cannabis, and how this will be shared between the federal government and the provinces. The provinces and Canadians will have to wait to hear from the Minister of Finance on that matter. Because the existing cannabis market is so substantial, it's critical to shift the dialogue towards tangible, collaborative discussions on co-creating a taxable, provincial cannabis distribution model. First Nations, municipalities, provinces, and the federal government all have the opportunity to realize the sustainable taxation revenues, providing inclusive and enforceable regulations are co-created with the cannabis industry as part of a collaborative public policy. It is my hope that the government doesn't sweep these under the carpet and tackles them, because the Canadians deserve to have clear and honest answers from their government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Oakville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I did want to thank the honourable member from Saskatoon West for her remarks. Mr. Speaker, the objective of this Act is to prevent young people from accessing and using cannabis. And I think everybody in this House understands the consequences of young Canadians who would chronically use cannabis on the long-term effects on brain and development. I think we all agree with that. As I mentioned earlier, when I'm in high schools in Oakville talking to the students, I talk about the health effects of marijuana, but I also remind them this is an illegal, it's illegal to possess it, and there's consequences to breaking the law. The member has spoken very passionately about decriminalizing marijuana. In the current environment, decriminalizing marijuana, I believe, would lead to an explosion of use. It would do the exact opposite of what we're trying to do, which is not have young people using marijuana. The solution is to regulate and legalize marijuana so we get it out of the black market. We protect students from access to it. We make it punitive for people that are trying to sell marijuana to young people, and we fix the problem. Decriminalizing it does the exact opposite. So could the member explain how, in her view, decriminalizing marijuana would stop the usage of marijuana by young Canadians?
Member for Saskatoon West.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. I wasn't implying in my remarks that decriminalization was the answer or the be-all, end-all. What I was saying that in the next 15 months, while the government proceeds with legalizing it, there will be young Canadians who will be caught by police with very small amounts of marijuana, and they will be charged and they will get a criminal record. And for many in my riding, that will be a criminal record for life because they will never be able to afford the amount of money it costs to get a pardon. What I'm saying is that in the interim, doesn't it make sense that the government not continue to put young Canadians with criminal records or even behind bars, while in the next 15 months they will actually be legalizing something that even a day earlier might be criminal? And I just didn't think that was fair, and I think the government should address that, and it could easily move forward and ensure that those criminal records don't happen for young people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her comments. And it appears through the discussion tonight that the NDP are going to be generally supporting this bill. But I want to ask a question specifically on the issue of allowing the limit of 4 plants per home. The Police Association is asking officials to hold off on home grows. They say that if Canadians have their own pot plants, it would run counter to the government's objective of what my colleague earlier referred to, a highly regulated and controlled system of legalization. The association argues that permitting homegrown cannabis will create too much work for law enforcement. Police chief said it would be a struggle to ensure Canadians don't grow too much or try to sell their crop on the black market. The chiefs also said it would be difficult to keep children and youth away from cannabis, and that home grow ops in general come with the risk of causing electrical problems and fire hazards that put first responders at risk. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, what is my colleague's position on the issue of allowing 4 plants per home in a time when we're saying we're going to have a highly regulated environment, which seems to run counter to that argument?
Honourable member for Saskatoon West.
I thank my honourable colleague for the question. And I think in my remarks, I sort of listed some of the top reasons I felt that there needed to be more work done on the bill, and the NDP are supporting this bill, and we hope that those things will be worked out in committee, and that the committee will be allowed to do its work and make any recommendations based on testimony of witnesses. And one thing could be included in that is some of the comments that my honourable colleague has shared about some law enforcement agencies and some of their concerns about the regulation within the Act, talking about the number of plants that individuals can have. I don't have a professional opinion on that, on the amount, but I would like to see the committee thoroughly review that and perhaps call forward some of the folks that have commented to you in the examples you cited.